Hello, welcome to the MalariaGEN Podcast, using genomic surveillance to better understand how to control and eliminate malaria. MalariaGEN.net. Today, I'll be speaking to Dr. Cristina Ariani, an evolutionary biologist from the Wellcome Sanger Institute. We'll be talking about how the COVID pandemic is changing genome research and what this means for the genomic surveillance of malaria parasites and mosquito vectors. Hello, Cristina. Can you explain a little bit about your background and how you came to be at the Wellcome Sanger Institute?
Yes, I am a biologist by training. I did my undergrad back in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro. And then I decided that I wanted to do my PhD abroad because I wanted to be embedded in different researches. And I did my PhD in Cambridge at Cambridge University. While at Cambridge, I studied mosquitoes, Aedes aegypti. And then in one of my trainings, because I was seeing that bioinformatics was becoming something more and more present in research, so I decided that I really needed to put some bioinformatics in my PhD because I originally didn't have. Then I found out about EBI and the Sanger Institute, and I did some courses there. And I thought, I really want to work here. And then reading on mosquitoes, Dominic's group, it was a very much targeted decision that I really wanted to work with Dominic's team on MalariaGEN and all of that. So right before my PhD finished, 6 months more or less before my PhD finished, I contacted Dominic, and then it all went from there. So I got a position as a postdoc, later on as staff scientist, and now as Genomic Surveillance Operations Lead.
Your work changed completely, not just because you were working in a lab and had to change, but because you've become involved in COVID surveillance. How did this come about?
Yeah, last year, as soon as the pandemic started, we started seeing some movement on Sanger showing interest in sequencing COVID samples. And then once I found it out, I immediately told Sonia, who is my boss and my line manager, what do you want me to do? I really want to be involved, because I thought it was a brilliant opportunity to contribute to a very important project. And then it all went from there. So the project was starting, a lot of pressure to build something from scratch, pretty much, receiving samples from different places, sequencing in near real time, and providing data back to the community. So it was an opportunity, I think, that I kind of took because it happened. And I thought it was a great opportunity to be part of something different and something extremely current. At that time in malaria, we didn't know what was going to happen, right? If it was, the pandemics had just started, so it wasn't clear how long we would be able to keep working. So I found myself in a position that right now perhaps I have a lot of work in this, a lot of very relevant work with this line, and why not contribute as well?
You mentioned it wasn't clear at the beginning of the pandemic. I think, we've all experienced that. And so how did it affect the rest of the malaria genomics team? Was everyone as affected, or did the genomic sequencing continue? How did that pan out as the pandemic spread?
Yeah, the genomic sequencing of the malaria work at MalariaGEN got affected as well, because what happened was most of the pipeline work, most of the operations to produce sequencing data was deviated from all of the research work into COVID work. And by the research, I mean all of the Sanger, other research, not COVID, including malaria. So for a while, Sanger was primarily sequencing and producing data for COVID. So there was an impact for sure on the operations for MalariaGEN.
Can you explain a little bit more about your role? What does a genomic surveillance operational lead do?
We do the operations side of things. Okay. So we do the end-to-end processes from the moment that the samples enter Sanger to the moment that a report is generated back to the government, to the Department of Health and Social Care. So we do the end-to-end processes. So I went from being a pure scientist to being operations lead, which was a big jump. Yeah, a big difference.
COVID is a small genome. How does that compare to something like a parasite genome, or for that matter, a mosquito genome?
Yeah, it's just a fraction. It's a tiny, the genome of COVID is so much smaller than the malaria parasite, or 100 times smaller than mosquito genome, which enables us to sequence more samples per lane than any other of these organisms.
We're here now almost a year later after the first lockdown in the UK. I believe it was at that point that Sanger started really getting involved in the sequencing. A year on, you have now applied your skills and experience to COVID sequencing. How long do you see this going on for?
We put a lot of effort into building a process that could last. Hopefully this is not going to be necessary for very long, but sequencing, the strategy at Sanger is to have the processes in place in case they're needed. So at the moment, the number of samples that we're receiving on a weekly basis have dramatically declined. For example, in January, we received about 200,000 samples, positive samples, data for 200,000 positive samples of COVID. And now last week we received for 15,000. So there was a huge decrease. But we do have the infrastructure now, and Sanger put a secondary lab, parallel lab, I should say, to deal with COVID requests and COVID-related sequencing. And this is there to stay for how long it needs, provided funding is secured, of course. But the idea would be to have it there as a contingency plan, for example, if things don't pan out the way that we would hope.
And what have been the main obstacles that you found in part of developing this new operational system?
Wow, there are so many.
Well, maybe we can limit it to the main one, maybe.
I think the main obstacle is the timeliness of everything, because it's actually the challenge, not the obstacle. So the challenge is because there are demands all the time, new demands all the time, because this is the common ground of the pandemics, isn't it? So there are new things happening all of the time. So the speed of requests and the speed in which we have to respond to some of the requests is amazing. So we have to be able to adapt and change in a matter of hours sometimes to change the full strategy. It takes one meeting for you to change a lot. So this is it is an obstacle, but I think I would call it more of a challenge, really, because it's the speed of change is interesting.
By comparison, what would you say that, in your experience, is the greatest success that you've had in this last year of working with COVID?
Well, I've learned a lot on operations, and I think I'm very proud to have contributed significantly for the sequencing of more than 300,000 samples in a year. The UK has done an immense job of sequencing so many genomes, and I'm happy that I've been part of this, ensuring that samples come into Sanger, arranging the arrival of samples, making sure that they flow through the pipelines of Sanger, and ensuring that the stakeholders who need it have it, the format and the way that they need. As part of Sonia's, I'm proud that we have and that we are doing this. Yeah.
As you've described, creating this sequencing capacity at this sort of scale has been both a challenge and a highlight. I'm wondering, what are the limitations? Have you come across limitations at doing it at this scale?
Yes, so now things are better in terms of the number of samples produced by the country as a whole. But in the beginning of January, one of the limitations was that we we didn't have, even though Sanger has a massive capacity, we didn't have enough capacity to process not even 20% of the samples because there were so many. So even with a very good fleet of robots and sequencing machines, the sheer number of samples were very high. So we couldn't cope with the demand for sequencing. So I think that was a limitation, just the pure number of samples that we were receiving.
Sanger's approach to engaging with COVID sequencing was, I believe, to form a consortium, or the COG UK consortium. How did that come about? Which institutions are involved in that consortium?
Yeah, there are several institutions across the whole of the UK, many in England, many in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. All of them, they are clinical hubs and they are sequencing hubs. So some hospitals will be providing samples to some institutes, and these institutes would be doing the sequencing, the genome sequencing. We at Sanger, we receive samples directly from the labs that test, not NHS labs, but the mega labs or the lighthouse labs, which is the name. So these are labs for people who test themselves or people who go to drive-thrus, and for that type of sequencing, for that type of testing. So at Sanger, we receive all of these samples. But the consortium is across the country with multiple different institutes.
This consortium has recognised your contribution recently. Well, recognised both you and Sonia. What have they recognised?
That was a very kind recognition, and I appreciate that. It was, I think, Sonia's and mine dedication for the operations at Sanger. We work tireless. You can see probably. It was making sure, and Alan as well, he's part of our team. So we just make sure that samples are flowing through Sanger in as quickly and timely as we possibly can. And that work is very resume what we do, but it is a huge challenge.
Samples are coming in every day of the week, weekdays and weekends. How have you managed to cope with that?
Yeah, thankfully I don't work in the lab, so I work mostly, well, I've been working most of the weekends these days because of reporting on specific studies, but we do work from Monday to Friday, and well, far more than 8 hours sometimes, but that is to ensure that everything is going smoothly. And because, as you say, we receive samples 7 days a week, and therefore we have to make sure that things are running and are fine. But there is a huge team that does that at Sanger. There are more than 40 people dedicated just for COVID work. So it's a huge team effort, and I think we are extremely lucky to have these people involved, because everybody is really, really good.
Thinking about some of the innovations that have happened due to COVID, or had to happen because of COVID, if you like, how can you see some of these innovations being applied to malaria genomic surveillance?
Yes. Some of the innovations, I would say, is providing data near real time back to stakeholders, in this case to the government, the UK government. So I think one similarity and one innovation that could be used in malaria world would be to provide data in a timely manner and in form of a genetic report card, which is already being doing, which is something that we are doing as well in COVID. So just as a context, we sequenced the data and we tried to optimize that time between the date of receipt of samples to the sequencing data available to the minimum time as possible. Then there is an analysis pipeline that runs and provides information on the variant of that particular sample. Then we write a report. There's a report that is fed back to DHSC, which is the Department of Health and Social Care, on a daily basis. So every day we report back to them. which is in a way is the same as the genetic report card that is being done in MalariaGEN. So with the difference there is the time between the sample arrives is collected to the time that the report is given back to the government. It's very short. So I think this is an innovation that could be beneficial to malaria.
And you mentioned that certainly in terms of UK COVID sequencing, it involved a lot of different institutions across the different nations. I'm wondering how much interaction there is with other bodies outside of the UK who are also involved in COVID sequencing.
Yeah, from Sanger ourselves, at the moment, we are focused more in the UK samples. But I know that there are other institutions across the UK who are more involved with genome sequencing of COVID elsewhere in the world, including Brazil and other countries in Africa. But at Sanger at the moment, we are focusing on UK samples.
And has Sanger in the past year then built up the capacity to sequence more, or it's more about process change?
Yeah, no, it's built a huge capacity. We started with I think we could sequence 3,000 samples a week. Then it went to 4,500 samples a week. Then it went to 10,000 samples a week. And now it's 20,000 samples a week, going to 25. And who knows where else.
Sanger does sequencing for a range of other diseases as well. Are those back on stream? Has it been able to build up the capacity for COVID and then bring up the capacity to do other sequencing work as well?
Yes. Because of that, because Sanger didn't want to affect the other work, we built a lab in parallel. So now all of the operations for sequencing other genomes, other parasites and human and mosquitoes genomes, it's all ongoing at the moment because we're doing the COVID work in parallel to all of that.
As you described, your background was about host-parasite interactions originally. Was it a difficult decision to make to leave your speciality and move into COVID work?
It was a decision that was naturally happening, and it got a little push with COVID because I was already considering moving from pure academic work to a more managerial role and a more operational role. So that was something that was already in my mind. So with the opportunity to work with this project, which is called Project Heron, which is the name of the project that sequences COVID at Sanger. So going from purely academic to a more operational role, it was something I already wanted to do. It was difficult because you have some ingrained concepts. So you miss talking about science, you miss going to talks, doing data analysis. I remember in the beginning of the work, the first month, I was just asking everybody if anybody needed some data analysis because I just wanted to do some coding. So, and then I got all the reports that I had to run up until these days. Yeah, so it's a difficult transition, but it's fine. I think every transition has their challenges, but it's also good to change. I like it.
You've mentioned that COVID sequencing will go on for some time, but now appears to be more in a controlled format, and Sanger has expanded capacity to do both COVID and other work. For you, what do you see the opportunities are outside of COVID?
Yes, that is a good question. Yeah, so now with this experience of ensuring service delivery, end-to-end processes of a very high throughput facility and making sure that data is fed back to stakeholders, I think it can contribute to other projects, particularly in timeliness and with the change, which was the obstacle and the challenge, but I think that gave me a lot of strength as well and resilience. So I think moving forward, I would probably be in a project that needs somebody can adapt to change really quickly, and I will bring a lot of change as well, probably.
And would you look to move back into malaria research specifically where you started? Would you return to that, or you now have a broad skill that is applicable to a wide range of areas?
I think there are the two sides. I don't think it's in my plans at the moment to go back to science itself, to doing science with my own hands. But I definitely, I think it's very hard to leave malaria. And I can't see myself completely leaving malaria because, you create such a strong bond with the partners, with everybody, with the team at Sanger, that it's hard to say, no, I'm going to leave. So I don't think I can do that.
Have you been in contact with, or have you been able to be in contact with the partners during this time at all, given your work schedule?
No, unfortunately, I barely speak to my partner here. But no, I haven't. It's been crazy busy, and I haven't been able to keep in touch with malaria partners, unfortunately.
Do you know if any of those partners have been involved in COVID work within their own countries?
Yes, I think Ghana had a very successful story, right? That they could use optical sequencing to apply to COVID. I think it's a very successful story.
Well, we've come to the end of our allotted time, and I know that you still have more Heron meetings to attend. So thank you so much for sharing your insights into the amazing work going into COVID sequencing.
Lovely, Heather. Thank you.
Good. Thank you
very much.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Brought to you by MalariaGEN.net.